Welcome back to the World Medical Innovation Forum. My name is Jeff Golden. I'm the chair of pathology at Brigham Health and the Ramzi Cotran professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School. Thank you all for joining us, and it is my pleasure to be here to discuss accelerating diagnostics. And as you've heard throughout the day, diagnostics have come up many times. This is really one of the central elements of what we need to be doing to address this pandemic. With me today are Jim Brink, who is the Chief of Department of Radiology at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the Juan Taveras, Professor of Radiology at Harvard Medical School, John Iafredi, the Vice Chair, Academic Affairs at Massachusetts General Hospital and Professor of Pathology at Harvard Medical School, Celine Roger-Dalbert, the Vice President for Diagnostic Assays, Research and Development, Integrated Diagnostic Solutions at BD Life Sciences, and Matt Sauce, President and CEO of North American Roche Diagnostics Corporation. Thank you all for being with us today. So I'm just going to set the stage before I start asking our panelists anything. And you know, it wasn't until sometime in late January when the sequence for this novel coronavirus was released, and essentially no one was given permission to start developing tests other than what the CDC was doing, and as we all know, there were complications with that assay, until March 2nd. I remember it was at 3 o'clock. I was actually at a conference out in Los Angeles, and at that time there was a mad rush to get things done. And since then there has been a continuous mad rush to get things done, and not the way we like to do things in our departments and in industry as well. So I'd like to start out the questioning from really the collective experts on this panel to think about what are the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic, and how will you use these in the future, whether for this COVID-19 or for other pandemics that might come up. And Matt, maybe I'll start with you and ask you if you could give us some comments and your thoughts on that.
So that we don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel every time we send product out. And then, George, you already alluded to, a tremendous amount of work on sourcing, to the extent that, some cases we've been able to simply identify alternative industrial sources of products that we need so we can continue to sell to customers the products that we would traditionally sell. And we've also been able to look at things even like when we get to a certain adequacy of supply. We spent a lot of money in the first month on air freighting product from the Far East. Now we're looking at how do we bridge that into lower cost solutions, because this will stay with us. So there is actually, I would say, this question 7 versus question 11 has really become, I would try, more of a tactical. How do we ensure readiness, and then how do we deliver it as cost effectively at this point, which is really a great place to have gotten to already.
Yeah. No, and by the way, I think we've combined question 7, 11 into that sort of future and durable, because you're right, the plan's there. It's a continuum. Yeah.
Can I ask George what?
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
I'm sorry. I was just curious what our plans are for basically sort of building up a stockpile, because we're to some extent, we're still dependent on.
Celine, maybe we can go to you.
I will try and see if you hear me. So we had multiple lessons learned. One of the key one was about having in place the mechanisms to track infection and react quicker than what we have done. While also working with the CDC to help in the national surveillance programs they have in place. We need really to have near real-time data that will track new infections, but also future emerging infection worldwide. We heard a lot also about decentralizing the testing and direct-to-consumer testing. There's probably a middle ground that we can achieve in that area without compromising the quality of the testing and the accuracy. We may want to rely more on telehealth medicine as an example, self-collection of samples and guided diagnostic and therapy, to reduce the interaction with healthcare workers, to also control the spread of the infection, and offer better patient care outside the hospital.
Great, thank you, Celine. John, maybe your comments from the Academic Medical Center?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes, yes.
Well, I think the main things that we need, especially next time, are going to be better speed and coordination, especially of the regulatory science aspects and the scientific aspects. It's really a lot to ask of us to roll out tests at the speed that we needed to do that, especially in a complex distributed system like in the United States. We don't really have a centralized ability to roll out tests across the country like some of the other countries were able to do. And maybe that's a weakness of our system. Often we can lead in innovation, but in this particular instance, maybe the U.S. was at a disadvantage. So it may have been a little bit unfair to expect the system to respond, the diagnostic system, I would say, to respond so quickly. What did we need was a two-phase response, and that's exactly what we saw. In the future, we will also do something similar, which the first phase is most likely to be a lab-developed test or homebrew type version of diagnostic assays. The CDC assay deployed across multiple sites is a good example of that, followed by companies like BD and Roche having the ability to come in with low-cost, high-quality, commercial-grade assays that can be deployed at scale across the country. That's what we did. It just took a few weeks longer than what we wanted, or a month longer than what we wanted. So I think in the future, speed and coordination is something we will work on almost certainly at the national level. It was an interesting bit of timing for those of you who do pay attention to the diagnostics field that Congress put forward the VALID Act in early March for commentary, which is an act that would help oversee lab-developed tests. It was almost exactly the week at which many hospitals or laboratories were trying to set up their own lab-developed tests for coronavirus. So we're in a complicated situation from a regulatory standpoint in the U.S., and I think going forward we need to tighten that down if we want to be able to respond better in the future.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, John. Jim, I'm going to come back to you in a second to talk a little bit about your experiences in radiology, but maybe you have some reflections on the testing in this current pandemic and what we've learned.
Sure. Actually, the thing that's impressed me the most has been just in the push for rapid testing and, frankly, all aspects of COVID care, the degree to which social determinants of health have really impacted our ability to deliver testing and care is remarkable. With the preponderance of this disease in communities that are unable to socially distance as well as others, the challenges associated also with just language difficulties. I'm so pleased that we work in an organization that has put so much energy into trying to address disparities related to language, whether it be through texting updates about COVID care through multiple languages and multiple channels, to fielding teams of volunteers who speak multiple languages to the care teams to help ensure that those for whom English is not their primary language understand the instructions and the care management plans, both for rapid testing as well as all aspects of the COVID care.
Yes, and as you've heard throughout the day today, this social determinants of health have really come up in multiple different panels, and I think are clearly something we need to pay close attention to going forward. Jim, I'd like to kind of look forward to you and say, what can you, thinking about radiology and what you've learned over the years in radiology, what lessons might we be able to apply to pathology, and should we be thinking about from what you've done in diagnostic testing around radiology?
Thank you. So our specialty is about 120 years old. That's when the X-ray was first discovered. And I would say for its first 70 years or so, not a whole lot changed with regard to the physics of X-ray generation, maybe some technical improvements on a fairly slow rate. But about 50 years ago, about the birth of the computer and computer science is when our field really began to explode with just very rapid innovation, really occurring almost as fast as the evolution of the computer industry itself. So really the past 50 years have been punctuated by very rapid changes, including the generation of computed tomography, magnetic resonance, two-dimensional ultrasonic imaging, nuclear medicine imaging, PET imaging, and so forth. And that very rapid evolution of our discipline has really required that we evolve very rapidly with it and really adopt some principles that really help us to do so.
And are there any things in this evolution that remain as challenges that you could help us think about? And what are some of the things we've learned that you've adapted in radiology?
So I would say there really are sort of two main factors that I think are important to keep in mind when trying to respond quickly to rapidly evolving technologies. And the first is more qualitative, and it has to do with really ensuring that decisions are made with the patient as the focal point for those decisions. A good friend of mine once said that it's tough to put the patient in the middle if you're there already, and so I think this is a critical element to our decision making, that as we look at new technologies, if it doesn't advance the patient's interests first and foremost, then the road ahead will be rocky, particularly if it's favoring other parties such as the providers or other third parties. It's really all about making sure that those decisions are really grounded in what's best for the patient. And the second factor is really more technical, and I think that as new technologies emerge, it's been very helpful to have standards that allow those technologies to be both interoperable and portable to other legacy systems. And for radiology, this was really primarily housed in what's called the DICOM standard, the Diagnostic Imaging Communications and Medicine Standard, developed around the mid-'80s, and it's a living, breathing standard that evolves almost yearly. As new technologies emerge, it also helps us bring those technologies very quickly into our legacy system so that we can adapt and adopt them almost as fast as they're developed. And it's really that kind of standard definition that enables very seamless portability and interoperability of new technologies.
Yeah, that's great. And as you probably know, here at Brigham Health and actually across MGB, we've been working hard to try and bring some of that standardization to pathology as well. Celine, I'm going to turn to you and ask, we've heard a little bit now about the kind of what happened during this pandemic, some lessons learned in that. We've heard a little bit about how radiology has done things. How do you view the diagnostics industry as well as academic organizations developing tests that will enable us to move forward in society and really thinking about it in terms of society?
Okay, so very clearly three things that will be needed to be most effective in moving, for instance, out of the lockdown phase. So one is testing if people have COVID-19. The second one will be testing if people had COVID-19. And as I said earlier, I think the surveillance to provide like near real-time data to show if there is a renewed outbreak will be needed. When I'm saying to test if people have COVID-19, we have to rely usually on either a molecular test or an antigen detection assays. There are room for all this type of testing, high throughput, high volume testing for molecular in core and reference lab will give you clinical results in 1 to 3 days. There is also a need for similar accuracy in terms of results with molecular methods, but more in the hospital or acute care settings. And in that case, you will have results within 1 to 3 hours. But what will also be important is to have antigen detection assays that can be used in pharmacy, in retail clinics, and maybe not why in schools or places where you want to test if someone has symptoms, if they can be COVID-19 positive. This type of test will be more rule-in, meaning that it will tell you if you are positive. If you are negative, it will be a little bit harder to conclude, and usually you will need to reflect to a molecular test as well. To answer the question, have you had COVID-19 previously? We need to test through serology. Serology tests are looking usually for antibodies that are produced by the body to fight COVID-19. This test will tell you if you have had past exposure to COVID-19, if you have had infection. Some of them are silent infections, so we need to detect these cases as well. And it's really needed when we will better understand the immune response. If someone has immunity to COVID-19, we don't know for how long it will stay, but that's important to know because that can be a way to go back to work, for instance. And as I said earlier, for me, the third piece will be the surveillance technology to track outbreaks. We need to try to track that real time to be able to have an early warning system if, for instance, COVID-19 starts to reemerge in some hotspot or specific area.
So that's great, and this is such an important area. I thought maybe we could expand on that a little bit. And John, maybe I'll turn to you. And any other concepts or ideas that you want to make sure you get across to the audience regarding both the RNA, the serology tests, the antigen tests, and what does it mean for someone to be immune, and what does high immunoglobulins mean?
Yeah. I think Celine gave a great overview of the diagnostic issues. I would say what I've learned in talking to many people and looking at data is there remains a lot of confusion about what test to use when. And when are tests good and when are tests bad? Some people say, well, PCR is not a good test, and some people say serology is not a good test. It really depends, to be honest, in the symptomatic population, what day after the onset of symptoms we're talking about. So that we've really learned a lot. Early on in the acute infection, obviously PCR remains the gold standard, is very sensitive, declines over a few days. And by about day 7, about half of people who are symptomatic we don't detect by PCR. And that's important for people doing diagnosis to know. On the other hand, antibodies you can say are bad. They're not necessarily bad. You have to know what day you're looking at and what population. Of course, you need to not look at immunosuppressed individuals, but in immunocompetent individuals, by about day 7, half of people have developed antibodies. So the antibody test becomes better and better over time, and by day 14, essentially everyone has antibodies. So that may be common sense to most people, but when you're thinking about whether a test is good or bad, you have to think about what day after symptom onset you're talking about. In the asymptomatic population, we're still learning. We essentially don't have data in the asymptomatic population to know how to interpret that information. Celine, I think, pointed out nicely, antibodies tell you, have you been infected? That will be useful after about 7 days. PCR tells you, are you infectious, right? So those two concepts are important. But there are nuances to that. So PCR tells you, are you infectious? But we have data from the Wolfel group in Germany and now the CDC that says after about 10 days you don't detect infectious virus. You may detect virus by PCR, but not infectious virus. So we can't hang our hat purely on PCR to tell whether someone's infectious. And then from an immunity standpoint, it's just going to take months and months for us to figure out whether there's protection. Even if you're strong IgG positive, we may say as scientists, yeah, we're pretty sure that you're going to be immune, but pretty sure is not going to be good enough for patients who might be re-exposed and reinfected and get ill. So we've learned a lot, but unfortunately we still have a lot to learn, and that's the situation we're in. We're asked to do this on a time scale that we've never been asked to do it before.
Right, great, John, thank you. That was really helpful. Matt, I know we had some technical difficulty, but I understand you're back with us, is that correct?
That's my understanding. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes, that's great. I don't know if you've been able to hear some of this last discussion, but we really are getting into some of the details about the specifics of the testing, and I just wondered if you had anything to add, particularly around thinking of, or do we use the same test everywhere? Do we need to standardize? Do we do things differently? What's the best way to think about this going forward?
No, it's a great question, and I did catch the end of what John was saying there, specifically around the use case for serology and understanding seroexposure and seroconversion. And I do think that certainly as more people become affected and also as I think the scientific community gets a better understanding of what seroconversion means in terms of immunity, and that's going to have to be borne out in longer term studies, that the combination of those two tests is going to be really critical to be deployed. So as John said, one test is going to determine, do you have an active infection? Are you infectious? The other one, have you been infected? And I think as we have a better understanding of what that seroconversion means for immunity, using those two tests in tandem is going to be critical for managing the return to work and managing the pandemic going forward. So fully agree with that.
Great, thank you. One question that's come in from the audience, which is really an important one, is the use of testing for the convalescent serum therapy. And I wonder, John, maybe I'll ask you, any thoughts around how we can use any of this testing to ensure that convalescent serum that we would be potentially treating patients with may truly have neutralizing antibodies?
Yeah, there are a number of research approaches currently to viral neutralization in vitro assays that you can use. In our hands, most of the patients with high titer antibodies to the receptor binding domain of the spike protein did show neutralization in vitro, but that needs to be borne out in clinical trials of convalescent blood products. One thing that many people aren't currently looking at are the recipients, and are there antibody or other biomarkers that could be used in the recipients to define who would benefit the most. So we're actively learning about the correlates of immunity, especially in those that are severely affected in our ICUs and hospitals. And that may lead us down the road of not just finding the right donors, but the right recipients.
Yeah, that's great. And there are tests out there that people are using that are called neutralizing antibody tests, but we don't know what those are going to mean in patients yet. And so this is more of what we just need to learn, just as John was describing. So we have just about enough time for each of our panelists to give maybe a 1-minute synopsis of what the big things they're thinking are. And so, Jim, maybe I'll start with you and ask, in about a minute's time, what do you think are the big things that are you're thinking about regarding diagnostic testing?
Well, just to shift over to radiology for a moment, it's all about just trying to create an environment that draws patients back and gives them confidence that we can provide safe and effective care in our imaging facilities. And I think that is true for really all of medicine. And it's really working out the details, having an effective communication plan to assure patients that they can trust the healthcare system to keep them safe and keep them well. But those are really the primary objectives that we're focused on in our department today.
Yeah, that's great. And Jim, as you know, that's come up in multiple panels throughout the day as well. The importance of making the community and the patients we care for feel safe and confident in coming to the hospital and coming to see their physician, so that we can continue to deliver care. Celine, maybe I can ask you to give a little synopsis of what you're thinking about in this space?
Yeah, sure. So I will insist on the fact that we need to do the right test at the right place, and there are tests that could not apply broadly, so that's something we need to keep in mind. And it will be linked to the accuracy of the test as well. If you use it for the right patient population at the right place, you will get accurate results. I think moving forward, we'll learn also a lot about working together across academia and the industry, and that's probably something that we should leverage even further after this crisis.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate the partnership that we've experienced across MGB with industry has been really highlighted during this pandemic and has been a tremendous advance in terms of what we've been able to do. Matt, some final comments from you?
Sure. I think from me, what's certainly one thing that's critical is keeping the patient in the center. A panel I was on a couple of weeks ago, Scott Gottlieb mentioned that, we have this kind of pandemic. Usually what it exposes is that the lowest, the product with the lowest margin in the supply chain becomes a bottleneck, and you see it across things like swabs. You also hear about it with medical glass, with the forthcoming vaccines. So really, I think understanding that whole patient journey and keeping that central is critical, I think, for managing, how we respond to this pandemic and pandemics in the future. So the other one I think is this strong partnership between the FDA and the manufacturers, which I think has worked extremely well from our perspective, and see that continuing on into the future. Both of those things I think are really central from my side. And the final really being how important it is to have adequate testing infrastructure throughout the United States. I think one of the things that's really key for the country to scale up and do so quickly is having that infrastructure in place. So Those are the ones that I reflect on the most.
Yeah, all really important and great points. Thank you, Matt. John, we're going to end with you.
Sure. Other than waiting for a vaccine, which is not our main mission in this panel, I would add a couple of comments. First, I think the FDA actually deserves, to build on Matt's comments, the FDA deserves a lot of credit here. It may not get a lot of it. They've tried to do their absolute best in a crisis situation with hundreds or even thousands of diagnostic assays appearing at their doorsteps, not to mention the drugs and other therapies. And I think they've come up with a logical approach to this, and I give them a lot of credit, and maybe we can extend the emergency use in the future in a logical way. The things I'm interested scientifically are community seroprevalence studies. We really need to understand what immunity is. Are people protected if they are antibody positive? I think all of our return to work protocols are going to be dependent on knowing whether people are predicted to being immune. And then finally, just briefly, I would hope really next time it's going to be a very different situation. One, we're going to have incident command and emergency management tools put into place to respond to an emergency like this. But also, I don't think anyone I'm thinking just in an AMC, no one is going to question whether, when we ask for resources, anyone's really going to question whether we deserve to have those resources for diagnostics. And so in many ways, I think this pandemic will help us in the diagnostic field have the resources we need to respond next time.
Great. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. There's much more we could talk about, but thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the World Medical Innovation Forum. Bye-bye now.